Well, without further ado, Eureka McConnell Science Museum is proud to present another virtual science park. And today we have a dedicated volunteer, Mark Kadnuck, who usually comes and helps prepare exhibits, and he's going to share about his travels to the Arctic.
And this isn't a huge science presentation. It's more of what I did on my summer vacation presentation. But yeah, I took a trip a little over a year ago, well up above the Arctic Circle, to hunt for caribou with my longbow. Now the presentation, I'm not including a lot of hunting pictures, more just experiences in the Arctic carrying a longbow. Let me get things pulled up here. We practice this, so hopefully it works. Okay, can everybody see that? Hello?
Yep, that's looking good.
Okay. Just to start out, I know hunting's sometimes controversial, but it's always been a part of my life. I mean, for about as long as I can remember. And I truly think it's in my genes to be a hunter. I mean, and I just put up this rock art panel to show some fellow longbow hunters. I mean, how I hunt is pretty basic. You can't get much simpler with the tools I use. They're a little more modern than what these guys used, but like I said, I've always been a hunter for as long as I can remember. I've been into lots of other things. I've raced bicycles for 10 years. I raced in Europe. I've snowboarded all across North America, done heli trips up in British Columbia, was into dirt biking, motorcycles, till I broke too many bones. But the thing that's always been a constant with me is hunting. And there's just something about not just being in nature, but participating in nature that is special to me and something I need. These are the bows that I typically hunt with, or similar ones like this. The top one is a little long bow that I use quite a bit, that was custom made for me by a guy in Michigan. And the bow below that was actually a bow that was made the year I was born, and I hunt with that a lot too. It just kind of has some special meaning, hunting with something that's as old as I am. But to the trip, this was kind of a bucket list item for me. Me and some buddies decided to take this trip, and you've got to plan quite a bit in advance to figure things out and get your transportation set up and all your logistics together, because it's a lot of planning and it's a lot of preparation. But the little dot on there is where our camp was. And if you can see the big white sandbar to the left of the red dot is where the planes flew in and landed and took off from to drop us off there. These are some screenshots from Google Earth, so I'm just going to kind of give you an idea of where we were and kind of back out as we go here. So if you can see down in the lower left on that screenshot, I don't know if you can read it or not, but there's on the end of that peninsula is a little village called Kotzebue. And we were able to take a commercial flight from Anchorage to Kotzebue. And then from Kotzebue to our campsite was just some some little planes. We got 3 people per plane. There were 4 of us that went, so we ended up taking 2 planes in. Kotzebue itself's above north of the Arctic Circle, and then we went further north from there. We're up kind of in the Brooks Range, kind of in the middle of the Brooks Range, between kind of 2 ridges of the Brooks Range, but not quite to the North Slope, but pretty dang close. Here's the big shot to show how far north we really were. We were up there a ways. Also, this is very informal, so if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask anytime. So we were quite a ways from Colorado. One of the guys that went lived in Denver, so the 3 of us over here drove to Denver. We flew out of Denver, went from Denver to Seattle, and then Seattle to Anchorage, Anchorage to Kotzebue, and then from there we flew into our little camp in the little plains. Depending on how long this takes, another place I visit regularly to hunt is where this dot is showing, which is down on the border of Mexico and Arizona, and it's another unique and interesting landscape with some interesting critters there too. So I do some traveling with my longbow. This is flying up to Anchorage. So what you see there is some of southeast or southwest Alaska. This is a lot of the country that the Alaska cruises go by, where you've got all the glaciers coming down into the ocean there. There's a lot more snow down south. Once we got up to Kotzebue, it's a little village. I mean, it was obviously a native village at one time, but it's probably one of the more developed villages now, even though it's got a runway for commercial jets can land, but it's still pretty close to third world up there. I mean, some of the structures that people live and survive in up there are pretty basic. Pretty rough life up there, I would think. But this is looking from our hotel room out to the this part of the Arctic Ocean. This is the, I don't know how you pronounce it, but I think it's the Chukchi Sea, but it's a southern part of the Arctic Ocean. Oh, just a little visitor information from the town of Kotzebue. It was a pretty expensive flight getting up there. Not something you'd want to do every day. Something I did to help offset the cost was knowing well in advance I was taking this trip. I applied for an Alaska Airlines credit card and racked up a bunch of miles on that in the year and a half, and pretty much covered my commercial flight. Something to think about though, if you're taking special trips, there's some ways to make it cheaper. We got there in the afternoon, evening. We had some time. We just wandered around town a little bit, but this is kind of what you can see all over Kotzebue. And if you look, there's junk cars and refrigerators and big pieces of junk everywhere. And I think part of the reason is it probably cost just about as much to get rid of that old junker car as it did to buy it, because I mean, the only way into this village is by boat or air. So getting rid of their trash is an issue. They named a street after me, which is kind of nice. But again, you can see how primitive and weathered and beat up the structures are in this town.
It's nice that they have it in the native language too, Mark, so you can learn your name.
The yuck part I can understand. That was the Bayside Inn. That's where we stayed. Pretty basic, but the rooms were close to, they were over $200 a night. And there were like no covers on the outlets and, you know, faucets dripping, and it was pretty rough lodging for what it cost. But luckily, something you're really dependent on is your flight out into the bush, as they say, is really weather dependent. So we were supposed to go out the next day, and we were lucky enough that we got out the next day. There were some guys staying at this same hotel that had been there 3 or 4 days waiting for the weather to clear where they were headed, so they've just been sitting around in this town and hotel for 3 or 4 days. So we lucked out there. This was our transportation up to our camp. We had to book this flight about a year in advance. They get booked up that quick. We flew about an hour and a half into our camp. And so our round trip from Kotzebue to camp and back was $2,500. So it's not cheap. And that's definitely the biggest cost of this experience, was your flight into the bush. And it's not cheap, and it's hard to come by. Like I said, these things get booked up well in advance, so you really have to do some planning. The reason we ended up choosing this one is most places that we looked into for caribou hunts have you basically have like 7 days where you fly in one day, you can hunt for 5 days, and then fly out on the 7th day. And you also have a weight limit of 50 pounds, which is not very much when you start thinking about the gear you need to survive in the Arctic, as well as food. But this guy, he's not an outfitter. He's considered an air taxi. So all he does is fly you in and fly you out. He gives you, they aren't allowed to like give you any hunting advice, because that would be guiding. So he's just an air taxi. But he didn't care how long we stayed in. And he also had an 80-pound gear limit per person. So that gave us the opportunity to bring more food. So we were able to stay longer. So we had a planned trip of staying in for 14 days rather than 7 days. And typically when you're hunting with a longbow, you need a lot more time to hunt. I mean, it's a lot more challenging than with a gun or with even a compound bow. I mean, we pretty much have to get within 20, 25 yards of the game we want. So this guy, the other thing that with the higher weight limit, we were able to go with rather than each sleeping in little backpacking tents, we were able to combine weight. So we divvied things up, and we were able to take a bigger tent that we could actually sit up in. We basically all stayed in the one tent. If you get socked in weather when you're up there, you don't want to be spending 3 or 4 days laying down in your backpacking tent with it raining outside. So that was nice. This was a nice option. It worked out good for us. So off we went. Another thing, the guy that was the pilot in the last picture, he was the owner of this air taxi, and he also hunts with a longbow, so he knew what we were up against. So when me and my buddy got in the plane with him, he asked us, he goes, if either one of us got airsick. I'm like, no, hesitantly. And he goes, okay, well, we'll do some scouting on the way in. And he goes, I know you guys would prefer to be dropped in a place where you have some cover, some trees and brush, and to be able to sneak in on animals. He goes, we'll look on the way in. He goes, but right now most of the caribou are up north on the tundra, which is pretty dang open. So he at least gave it a try to find a spot that would be more conducive to our hunting style. But there's a little village of Kotzebue. It's kind of on that little spit, and it must be protected naturally from bad weather and tsunamis, because it wouldn't take much to have the whole town wiped out by a big wave when you see it from this view. Just some other views cruising out. I don't know if any of you ever flown in a little plane before, but it's fun. We got some, if you look down there right on the coastline, you can see along the coast there's some little structures along the way that are native built, and they're really basic and pretty junky and pretty trashy. And you know, people take their little fishing boats to these little huts, I think, to either hang out in the summer or hunt from, or I'm not sure what they use them for, but it's all little native structures. Alaska is very wet, and this is still near the coast, so all this low-lying land is, you know, just feet or underwater, feet above or feet underwater. Start traveling a little inland. We got a few trees and some color, and you can see the change in from the ocean, which is the gray water, to you can see that little clear fresh water where there's just a little spit of gravel that runs along that, keeping the two separated, but there's quite a difference in water quality there.
And Mark, what month was this?
September. So it was, I think we flew out of here, I think this was the 7th of September last year. So just some more pictures of the coastline. Sitting in the plane. This was actually only the second time I've flown in a little plane like this, and I'd never landed in one. The first time I flew in a plane like this, I jumped out of it. There you can see some more those little shacks along the coast.
A couple questions. What was the average temperature while you were there during the day?
That's a good question. When we tried doing some research ahead of time to kind of know what type of gear to bring. And since we didn't know exactly where we were going to be, we just started pulling up some temperatures from the region, basically. And our best guess was that we were going to have temperatures upper 40s to low 30s. And that's kind of how it started out, but we ended up with temperatures down into the teens, low teens. So it ended up getting about 20 degrees colder than we expected. And I would have liked to have had one more layer, to be honest. It got chilly. So yeah, so we had mornings that were 12, 13 degrees.
So my other question was, when you showed that village of the homes, it kind of looked like some of them were on some type of stilts or raised.
Yeah,
ground.
there were. Yeah, some of them were. And I was assuming that was just precaution for if they did get some type of tsunami or high, a bad storm with high tide and big waves, but the majority of them weren't. So I don't know how they survived as long as they have.
But so does that happen to those waves or tsunami? Does that happen often up there?
It must not, because like I said, so many of the structures were still intact and they look pretty dang old. Mm-hmm. In this picture, you can see these there's lots of meandering braided streams up in Alaska. And I know other parts of Alaska. This was the third time I'd been to Alaska, but the first time I'd been this far north and really this remote. The other two times I'd flown into Anchorage and basically traveled by vehicle up to like Denali National Park and down on the Kenai Peninsula, where you see a lot of glacial valleys and stuff. And the glacial valleys have those real braided streams and meandering streams and flat valleys. But so I imagine this is similar region up here, but you just see a lot of it up there, lots of oxbow lakes and there's just a lot of standing water. I mean, any place you get a low spot, there's standing water. We had some, like this picture, you can see it was misting, raining. Down on the coast, it was pretty gray. There's a view of one of the old camps that the natives have built at some point. I mean, and these are probably, I don't know how old, these aren't old camps, as you can tell, but just this one was deserted, I'm guessing, because there was no roofs on anything and there was just more trash than anything laying around. We were starting to see the colors, though. It was beautiful. I mean, just Alaska is big and beautiful, awe-inspiring. It's raw. One thing it always, the trips I've taken to Alaska, the mountains, everything just seems newer there. It's like they were formed yesterday. But a lot of spruce and brush. This looks a lot more like moose country down here that we were flying through. And here you can see, again, meandering streams, little oxbow lakes, basically a swamp anywhere you got near water. Just more of the same, lots of windy, wet, swampy areas. Definitely moose country here. And on the way in, we saw moose, we saw bears, we saw Dall sheep, we saw caribou. As we got a little further inland, it started to clear up a little more, a little less rain and mist, more of the wet, meandering lowlands. Our pilot, the other plane went a different direction, and we took off first, and I guess we didn't know that, but we didn't know until we ended up meeting up again, landing. And the other pilot flew up, from talking with our buddies, flew up valleys most of the way, where our pilot, he took us over several mountain passes. And I mean, we just cruised through the little pass and then dived down the other side. And it was quite the experience. And then I understood why he asked us if we got airsick or not, because climbing up to some of these passes, it was almost like the plane was going back and forth on switchbacks, because he would zigzag back and forth to gain altitude to get up through to high enough to get over the pass. And he just dived down the other side. And it was fun. And it was beautiful. But we went through mountains, we went through the wooded areas, and here you can kind of see in the tundra looking stuff. I don't know if you can see like the fractures in the ground. And I found out it is basically a fracture. It's where the permafrost underneath is fractured, and you get kind of those patterns in there where the ice in the ground is fractures and forms consistent angles. But again, big meanders, little oxbows, lakes. Flying through one of the many, I guess they aren't really passes, but just the little saddles between peaks. We were well below peaks. We were right even with peaks, but it's just beautiful. I mean, it was very expensive flying in, but it was worth the price of admission. You can just see there's no roads up here. I mean, you can't get anywhere unless you've got an airplane. Some guys will have these pilots fly them in, and they'll take a raft and they'll float a river for 10 days and fish or hunt off the river and move their camp day to day. The colors were great.
It looks pretty rainy, Mark. Did you get a lot of precip, or was it just cloudy most days?
We had rain the first 3 or 4. Well, the first day we got there, it was just cloudy, and it was probably the warmest day we had and one of the calmer days we had. And we were able to get camp set up and, you know, keep everything dry. We weren't in a rush trying to get the tents up to get stuff inside. And then we had about 3 days of rain. But I'll get to that once we get up into camp. But just, I mean, it's so much bigger than anything you see in this state. You know, where here you go over a mountain or two and you're back into a civilization, and here it's just mile after mile of nothing.
How long was your flight in?
It was about an hour and a half. So here's after we, this is after they dropped us off, and that's the sandbar we landed on. These planes don't need a whole lot of space to land or take off. But it was an interesting feeling once those planes left you, and you're literally out in the middle of nowhere. You've got to be totally self-reliant from this point on, because it's, I mean, obviously we have contact. One of the things they require is that you either have a satellite phone, or Garmin, who makes the GPSs, make a product that's called an inReach, and you can actually text message on it via satellite. And that's what we used. And actually that's those pilots use them all the time. They have all their campsites marked on their GPSs. And so they asked us to check in once a day just to let them know that we were okay and what the weather was like up by us, because they kind of get weather reports from all their clients, so they know what it's doing in different areas of the state that they fly to. But it was a kind of an eerie feeling when you're left out there alone. So like I said, that day it was overcast, but it was pretty nice out. We had time to get camp set up, and as I mentioned, you can see our big tent. And then the little teepee thing over to the left, 3 of us didn't even know we had that till we got up there. And then one guy said, "Yeah, I brought this up. I thought it might be good to put all our gear in." And it worked out well. We were able to, we'd throw our backpacks and bows and stuff in there at night, and then the 4 of us slept in the dome tent. We had the river right by us for water. It was pretty clear, but we obviously treated it. We didn't want to be drinking straight out of the river. But you can kind of see, we kind of went north of the mountains and we're up beyond where the spruce forests were. What you see there is the willows were about the tallest plants around. There were a couple places where there were by some lakes where there were a couple trees, but for the most part, it was just wide open tundra. That was one of our gravity filters for drinking water, and that plugged up the first day. So we had a couple just small individual filters, and then we'd also just boil the water, because I mean we had 2 little camp stoves that we'd use to cook on. So this was the first day we were headed out, and it was raining on and off and wet and breezy, but it wasn't like a downpour, so off we went. Walking in the tundra was brutal. So a few pictures down the road, I probably have some closer ups, but the tundra, it was just, it's like clumps of grass. And in between each clump, you drop like a foot to 2 feet into these holes, and the holes were typically full of water. So you're either like trying to walk on top on basketballs, or you just give up and trudge through the low, wet spots. But it took a few days to actually get accustomed to walking on this stuff. Well, you can see kind of the hummocky, lumpy ground there, and that's typically what you're dealing with. But up close, it's even worse than it looks there. But what we started out going in pairs because there are grizzlies up here, and actually the first night after we got camp set up, I walked just about 100 yards east of camp and got up on this little hump and looked out, and I saw a sow grizzly with 3 cubs grazing along on the berries up just east of us a little bit. So, we stuck in pairs the first few days because we weren't sure what we were going to be running into, how often we'd be running into bears or whatever, anything else we might run into. But we'd spend a lot of time sitting and getting the binoculars out and just searching for caribou. You can see a long ways up there, but we spent a lot of hours behind the binoculars. That peak there was kind of due north of camp, and it was kind of a nice landmark to keep your directions, because flying up there with the cloudy weather and just the back and forth and up and down, I had no idea what direction was what. So it was nice to have a landmark to kind of keep your bearings.
Were you able to remain dry throughout this time, or?
Well, we, like I said, that first 3 or probably the 4th day, it started breaking up. We had steady rain on and off, and we had one thing, key piece of equipment is very good rain gear. But after about, and I had good boots, and after about 3 days, I was thinking or wishing that I would have taken a second pair of boots. But I mean, even with the 80-pound weight limit, trying to get 14 days worth of food plus just basic gear, that you really got to go bare bones. And, so with good, even Gore-Tex boots, just, they're getting the leather soaked through your feet, everything's damp and wet. So it's kind of getting wet from the inside and the outside. And after about that 3rd or 4th day, when it started cooling down, you'd get up in the morning and your boots would be literally frozen solid. So you've got to put your feet into that ice bucket, basically, to get them warmed up and get the ice melted off them. But there were definitely grizzlies around. I think probably saw bears almost every day. Not super close, but close enough to make you nervous. Just some more. There was still a little bit of green left. Everything hadn't died quite yet. There was, down lower in the bottom, there was some moss and stuff that was protected from the frost. But again, you can see the hummocky stuff there. But there were still some stuff growing green. Now brush it, but I mean, you can see on my friend here that, this stuff's not even knee deep. So when you're trying to sneak up on an animal to get within 25 yards of them with basically no cover was pretty challenging. We did see caribou just about every day too, and not a lot of, like I said, you can see for miles. So a lot of times we'd see them miles off and just watch them and see which way they were moving. And if they were coming at all in our direction, we'd try to move to get ahead of them and maybe get in one of those low spots or in a clump of willows or something and hang out and see if we get them to come close. Lots of hours looking, waiting, wandering around, looking at tundra. but never once was I ever bored. It was, always just being there was enough to keep your mind going. Occasionally get a little glimpse of a rainbow in the mist. we discovered these pretty early on. These are cranberries, wild cranberries, and they were actually pretty good. And when you have, you know, when you're eating nothing but dehydrated meals and instant oatmeal and anything we came across like this, you just find yourself, you get into a good patch of them and you'd end up grazing on them for half an hour before you even realize what you were doing.
Probably what the bears were doing too, huh?
Exactly. Yep. The bears were definitely eating the berries. There were blueberries too, and blueberries were about at the end of their lifespan. They were starting to get a little shriveled from the freezes and stuff that have happened already. There you can see a little bit of a rainbow. That's pretty much what I hauled around every day. We did take pistols because of the bears. We did fire our pistols. We had to run a bear off near camp one time. I mean, just for the noise purposes, we weren't shooting at bears. It was a little unnerving having the bear that close to your camp, you know, as it's getting dark, and all you got protection is that little tent fabric. I mean, big mountains in the distance. What we were in was what you see there is that just kind of the rolling tundra. There's a look down onto our camp. It was nice. There was a little, we had to keep our food. We stored our food about probably about 80, 100 yards away from our camp just to be safe. You know, we tried to keep you know, we didn't want just that smell around to attract the bears, because it's the last thing you want to be doing is dealing with a bear. We didn't have, that's me, you know, that's one of the earlier days I can tell because I wasn't all bundled up. We had a break in the rain. And to this day, I still don't know the name of that river we were on. I've tried looking it up on maps and just haven't had much luck finding anything. And it was a pretty sizable river, but there was not much. I walked by that river almost every day, and you know, I'd see a little fish every now and then dart off, but it wasn't, I think I'm guessing we were far enough inland that it wasn't full of salmon. Two of the guys that were on the hunt with me had been on a caribou hunt a few years earlier, and their first camp on that hunt, they were dropped by a stream that was full of salmon, and they had grizzlies everywhere. And they said they couldn't sleep at night because all they'd hear at night were just bones crunching all night long, and the grizzly just munching on salmon. They actually had to get their air taxi that they used that time to come back in and move them, because they literally couldn't sleep. They'd get up in the middle of the night and there'd be bears everywhere. There's some blueberries, and they were not abundant, but they were sure good. But you know, that's what the bears, you'd see them and they'd just be head down and they'd be grazing like cows. That's Phil, a friend of mine. He's early 70s, pretty adventurous guy. He's hunted all over the world. And he was happy to go with us young guys in our 50s. Another little rainbow.
So your friend there, you only had 5 arrows. That's all you're carrying?
I had 4. And actually, I had more in camp. But I had, in my quiver, I basically had only 4 arrow quiver. But I had, oh no, I had my 5 arrow. I had 5, you're right. But I had one that I just put a point on. It's called a judo point. And I would just, after sitting out there for hours, we'd get bored, we'd start shooting at just some clumps, and it's got a weird head that makes it so it doesn't bury into the ground. So you can just kind of use it for practicing and shooting while you're out there, like coming and going to camp, we'd shoot. middle of the day after sitting for hours glassing, we'd shoot a little bit. But yeah, that's basically all you had out with you. Was I had 4 broadheads and the 1 judo point. Typically you only need 1 if you need 1. But just Alaska is big. I mean, and it's just, no matter where you go in Alaska, it's big, and it's just big, wide open country. It's incredible place to visit. Just, like I said, big views in every direction. Some of the moss and lichens were pretty colorful too, and you had to look for it, but it was very pretty. There's some red and a few cranberries in there. Little red and yellow. It was, like I said, misting on and off. Phil was just carrying bear spray, and you can't take that on a commercial flight. So how he got that, when we were at the hangar for our little air taxi, some hunters that were coming out and were done with their trip just basically offered it to us if we wanted it. So Phil took it, which was probably a good idea. Not that we needed it, but it was nice to have the old selfie. Coming and going. This was one of the first nights up there. One of the things on my bucket list for this trip was to see the Northern Lights. So I think it was the second night we were up there. It was clearing up that evening a little bit. So I decided I was going to stay up to see if I could see the Northern Lights. And I don't know, I hardly ever looked at my watch up there, but I think the sun started going, I mean, it started getting, this might have been 8:30 in the evening. So it was still pretty long days up there, but it just wouldn't get dark. It stayed light forever. And about the time it finally started getting dark, I mean, I was out there freezing, you know, you can't have a campfire. There's no wood to burn. Those little willows are like, they've been the dead ones have been freeze dried so many times, like balsa wood. It burns up in a second. So I was just out there freezing, and once it finally started getting dark, then a full moon came up, and I'm like, oh, great. So I ended up going to bed. So I changed my plan for the Northern Lights. Anyway, here's a few days later, and you can see it's starting to get colder. So we're starting to get frost every morning. And it just, once it got clear too, and once it cleared up, the wind started coming out of the north, and it started cooling down, and it cooled down probably a couple degrees every day from once it cleared up. Breakfast, I typically had two packages of instant oatmeal every day. That was it. I think I did take 1 freeze-dried breakfast, but you couldn't take a whole lot, and pretty much everything had to be lightweight and the freeze-dried stuff. It was pretty when it was clear. You could see even further. Really didn't see a whole lot of birds. I saw a couple birds like this. There were ravens, of course, and then I saw like 1 duck. Sunny afternoon, my buddy passed out on the ground and got sunburnt. Handful of cranberries. One of the little lakes to hike out to. You can see the blueberries are starting to get a little shriveled up from just age and weather. There's some caribou, and I mean, that's a pretty sizable river. I mean, it's probably comparable to the Colorado River through town here, if not bigger. And I mean, and those animals just did not hesitate to get into that water. They'd cross it like it was nothing. That was a group of bulls. You can pretty much see antlers on all of them there. You can see them.
How far away were you
From those?
caribou? Uh-huh.
Oh, those probably about 400 yards, but almost impossible to walk over to where they were.
And do caribou, male and female, have antlers?
Yes, just the males are bigger. I think I got you know, it looks all nice and sunny and bright and open. But, you know, one thing, when you're out there for 14 days, you know, the most you get out of the elements is in that tent, and then all you're basically getting out of is the wind. But the next little slide is a short video of what it was really like you're dealing with day in and day out. I mean, it was not calm. It was, you're in a cold wind constantly. You try to just find a little, you can see the little hummocks in the ground. You'd get behind one of those and just get out of the wind a little bit and sit there and pull your binoculars up and watch for miles. One day I hiked out, and as I was hiking out, I spotted a grizzly bear a couple little rolling hills away. So I went down into a low spot and came back up the next ridge, and he was gone. So I figured he'd wandered off. So I ended up going one more ridge over and sat there and just got my binoculars out and was looking for caribou up on the high ridges. And I'd probably been sitting there an hour and a half, and I kept noticing these ravens hanging out in this one area and bouncing up and down. And I thought they'd found something that they were feeding on. But I pulled the binoculars up on them and started looking at them closer. And then I started seeing something else, something bigger, just a little brown spot pop up every once in a while. And it turns out that grizzly bear I'd seen earlier was right out there, and he was probably only about 250 yards away. And I'm guessing he had killed something out there and was feeding on it. And those birds were trying to get pieces of it because he'd chase them off every once in a while. But I mean, you can see this country. I was just sitting in that, and I was totally exposed. There was no way if that grizzly bear stood out of that little hole, he was going to see me. And I thought, what am I going to do if he starts walking to me? Because there's no way I can get anywhere without him seeing me. And the last thing you want to do is move in a hurry away from him, because then that just triggers their chase mode. So it made me nervous enough that one time when he plopped back down in his hole, I backed out of there pretty quick and hightailed it back a ridge or two, because it's a little unnerving. They're big critters and they're nothing but teeth and muscle and claws. Just a couple of guys, and you know, we'd spread out. We got to where we were spreading out, and you could see, you know, I could see my buddies a couple miles away when they were walking along a ridge line. This obviously wasn't that far away, but we got brave enough to where we split out and started doing some solo hunts and getting out on our own. Just another picture of Frosty Camp. We had that, if you look close there in the middle there's a red fox. I'm assuming it's an Arctic fox that turns white here shortly in the winter. But like I said, we didn't see a whole lot of wildlife. The thing we saw the most of was definitely caribou, and we never saw a lot of caribou, but we'd always see everybody'd at least see a handful of caribou a day. You know, they might be a couple miles away, but you might get close. Everybody, there's our camp down there on that little bench off the river. Everybody had a close encounter at some point with caribou, where we'd all got within longbow range at some point, but only one caribou was taken between the four of us. Just another picture of my landmark to the north. One day I was out by myself, and I just happened to look back towards camp, and I saw a friend of mine. He was just moving really fast across this ridgetop headed back towards camp. And the first thing that came to mind was a bear is in our food, and he's going back there to try to run the bear off so we have something to eat. So I decided it was either that or there were caribou that way. So I said, either way, I decided to take off back and help him out. And it turns out there were, go back on that little flat bench that our camp is on, right in the bend of the river, there were a bunch of caribou out there that he'd saw, and he was headed back there. And I watched him. I couldn't get close to him from where I was, but I got close enough to watch him try to get in close, and he got just about to where he was going to be able to get a shot, and the caribou got downwind of him and took off. So we ended up staying 13 days. We had them pick us up a day earlier so we could take care of the one caribou we got to get the meat ready for transport back to Colorado. This was one of the calm days. You could actually see the reflection in the little lake. There's the one duck I saw. So it was surprising. Like I said, we did see bears most days, usually off in the distance. The bears with cubs, it was weird. I don't know if it was just a local thing, but it seemed like the females were almost silvery white and the males were the darker brown. And then the cubs, like the one with 3 cubs, it had two white ones and 1 brown one. There's getting a little closer to some caribou. You know, when I'd get really close, I wasn't messing with the camera. I was hoping to get a shot. You can see that one's just a small bull. That's about the size of antlers that the females get too, but I'm sure that was a bull because the groups we'd see, they'd either be all cows and calves or it'd be a group of bulls. And this one was hanging out with like 4 other bulls. Pretty animal. They're kind of in between a mule deer and an elk size-wise. The biggest bulls would have a real white mane. Really pretty hide.
How far? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, no.
I was just going to say, how far from your camp did you hike, like throughout your whole trip? Did you kind of stay rather close, or did you go like 5 miles out, or?
No, probably about the furthest I got away from camp was probably, I'd say about 3 miles. Like I said, you don't realize it, but just walking, it was brutal hiking through that tundra.
Yeah, I bet.
It would just, it would wear you out because I can't explain it. And, that's everybody I've heard that's been up there understands it, but it's just something you can't explain how hard it was to walk across that stuff. We found some, as the days passed, we'd found some routes where you could avoid a lot of it, but you'd still get sections of it. But probably about the furthest I ever got was probably about 3 miles. But I'd do maybe a 6 mile loop in a day. We're getting out and around, coming a different way. Or this was when we were hiking out the one caribou that we did get, that one friend got. And that bench we were camped on was actually one of the easier places to hike. That was my lunch for 13 days. Have a tortilla, 2 pieces of jerky, a string cheese, crackers, granola bar, and a little payday bar. That along with blueberries and cranberries. Just another pretty sunset. Phil and Steve. That was one evening, getting out of the wind. This is where it was nice to have the tent because you could at least get out of that cold wind, and it was windy almost every day. You were dealing with the elements 24/7. And something before I forget, I told you I wanted to see the Northern Lights. There's a bear den. After my first attempt failed at seeing the Northern Lights, can you guys take a 5-minute break? My wife needs help for just a second.
Yes, we'll entertain ourselves, Mark.
Okay, it won't take long.
I'm really surprised about, I guess I had never thought about the texture of the tundra landscape. If anybody wants to, we can chat about things if you want to take yourselves off mute while we're waiting for Mark.
Guys are
Spent
pretty
some
brave.
time. I spent some time being in Alaska studying salmon, and on my days off, like Mark was in the middle of nowhere, so I decided to do some hiking, and it was terrible walking. He described it as basketballs, like with holes, but they're like basketballs that move. So it's like unstable hummocks.
No running, I imagine.
Has anyone else tromped around in tundra like that?
Not me.
Oh, Betty, you're muted.
Oh, go ahead. No, I was going to say, can you hear me?
Yep.
Mhm.
My son and I were in Alaska, 5 years ago on a fishing trip, but we went up north of Fairbanks. I don't know how far we were, but we did get in. Oh my gosh, it's like walking a giant wet sponge, an irregular, kind of a soft sponge. And found that we really needed to have hiking poles with snow boots, or not snow boots, but snow caps on them, in order to keep our balance, because it'd really throw you off after a while. But it's not easy walking, as Mark had said.
Well, Mike, if you go up the vertical bog on Mount Kenya, if you can hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
we can hear you, Betty.
Okay, it's the same, but it's vertical. And they have little hummocks, and you try to step on the little hummocks to stay out of the water, which is below the hummock, and you slide off into the water.
Ugh.
After the first 50 feet, you just give up and thought, okay, I won't even bother anymore. So your boots are wet, everything's wet. You get to the hut at night. It's below freezing, of course. And somebody named Betty forgot to put their boots in the sleeping bag. So the following morning, they were frozen stiff. And I know about it, that you put on these really cold, icy boots, because they're cold and icy for at least the first couple of hours until you get around and start hiking. But anyway, it's called a vertical bog, which means it's uphill, which might be a little harder than these bogs here, which look like they're relatively flat. But it's doable if you really want to do it.
All right, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Okay, good timing.
All right, so yeah, that's a bear den I saw. Like I said, that's one of the dark bears. That's the males were usually by themselves. Just a little old skull from a caribou.
Oh.
I was upstream of camp there on the river. Just some big barren mountains up there. This was in the area where one day I was out and I spotted a caribou, and it was probably 3 miles away across the river up on the ridgeline. And I watched it for probably 3 or 4 hours. And it ended up coming down and crossing the river, and it walked by me at like 30 yards. And of course it stopped behind the one big clump of willows, so I couldn't get a shot. And then the wind swirled around and it caught my wind and took off. But yeah, not much grows up here. There was our Caribou Feast. Different parts of Alaska have different regulations, and the part we were in, if you shot an animal, you have to bring out everything on the bone. You can't debone the meat to pack it out. So the one guy that shot the caribou stayed at camp one day and gathered up all the dead willows he could find and built a little fire and cooked the ribs. It was a pretty tasty meal, but after you've been eating dehydrated meals for 10, 12 days, just about anything tastes good. And it just kept getting colder in the mornings. And it was, I mean, it's hard to explain, but you've got nothing to warm you up other than a little bit of warm food in your belly. It was frosty. Oh, I didn't think I finished my Northern Lights story, did I? After that first night when I tried staying up late to see the Northern Lights, I gave up on that approach. And what I did was I drink a lot before I went to bed. And then I'd have to get up in the middle of the night and go outside. And it worked. And I saw the Northern Lights on 2 different nights where it was clear enough. And when I got up in the middle of the night.
Well, good job making sure you got up.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, when it's dark out and you know those bears that could be standing there 20 yards away, it's a little, even getting up to go to the bathroom is a little exciting. Let alone having to deal with 15 degrees and wind and frosted boots. More blueberries, more tundra. Like I said, it's the experience of being in the true wilderness. I mean, it's just something you can't get in Colorado. I mean, even if you get into a wilderness area, you always know that just over the next ridge is a road or something. It's different up there in Alaska for sure. It was well worth the effort. A few more caribou. Another sunset. Catching a little evening sun. More frosty tint. I'm not a coffee drinker, but all those guys were, and they had to have their coffee every morning. This was kind of cool. Down on the river, there was some really shallow water on the rocks, and when it would freeze, it would really made some interesting patterns with the ice and the rock and the different ice crystals. Like that, even this being one of probably the more barren parts of Alaska, it was just beautiful. I mean, in my word, just being out there, being in the wild, the wide open spaces. Here we are starting to take down camp. It was a real frosty morning and they were going to be picking us up that afternoon. So we had to, well, once the sun came up, get like the rain flies and stuff laid out to where they dry off so we could get them packed back up. And a lifesaver were those little packable camp chairs, because that's what we'd sit in to eat dinner and breakfast, and sitting on the ground would have been miserable. This was a little treat. It's was far off, but it was our last day there when we were packing things up. I looked off in the distance and one of the bears was out there earlier, and I looked out and go, oh, that grizzly's back. And then I looked closer and go, that looks like a buffalo. And then I looked even closer with my binoculars and saw that it was a muskox. So that was pretty neat to see one of those. There we are, waiting on the landing strip. We probably sat out there for 2 to 3 hours because they just tell you, oh, we'll be there this afternoon. So we had to be all packed and ready. And then luckily it was another nice day. And here comes our taxi back in. Even after 13 days of sitting out there doing nothing for hours on end, but looking through your binoculars and maybe watching a caribou off in the distance, I was not ready to go home. Here comes one of the planes in. These pilots were good. They obviously knew what they were doing.
Mark, how do you account for the weight of taking the caribou back out?
Well, they planned for that. And a lot of them, like if we'd have gone on a moose hunt with these guys, if you got a moose, because they're so much bigger, you were paying an extra $500 to haul it out. So our package included that if we got, they plan ahead, that they know that they can, they don't fly that close to the limit, that they're, but included in our price was the price to get the caribou out as well. So off we went, heading back to civilization. That's the river or the mountain that was kind of my north arrow. Kind of looks like the moon there. But then we head back in through the Brooks Range, back into some forest again, steep rugged mountain. Some of these pictures, the way the mist was, they almost came out looking like watercolor paintings. Steep rugged mountains. That almost looks like something you'd see coming out of our mining areas, like acid mine drainage. And I'm sure there's, mountains up there with the same chemical makeup, and I'm guessing that was what that was. Meandering, braided streams. I got to sit in the front on the way out, so that was kind of cool. He didn't let me fly though. This one really looks like a watercolor painting. There you can really see the fractures in the permafrost underneath the surface. And that's why there's water in all those low-lying areas, is because of the permafrost, because the ground is just frozen solid just a few feet down, so the water just sits on top. Back into some color. A little bit of snow on the ridge there. Getting back towards the coast. There's the Kotzebue out on that little spit, totally exposed. And coming in for the landing, it was a little interesting. So I kept thinking, why aren't we lining up on the runway? Here's our landing back. I was like, kept wondering, when are we going to move over? How come we're not going to be on the runway? I don't know if he can hear anything, but I can't hear it from this one. But I figured out why we weren't landing on the runway is because we were landing on the dirt next to the runway. I guess it's cheaper to land on the dirt than it is to land on the runway. I thought this was funny. This was back in the hangar, I noticed when we got back. But we had a day after we got the one caribou all off the bone and packed up for shipping, and we wandered around town. They had a little museum there, and there wasn't a whole lot going on in Kotzebue, but we killed a little bit of time in here. Wandered around town a little more. You wouldn't want to be driving a whole lot. Gas was not cheap. Oops. And that's the end.